Hey guys, it's Penguin here and welcome back to another gold making video. In today's video, we are going to be focusing on Inscription. So if you are somebody who plans on either picking up Inscription as a main profession, or you plan to have it on a side alt, this video will be for you. We're going to be discussing the pros and cons of this profession, recommended builds that you can spend your knowledge points in, and also just exactly what Inscription does in this upcoming expansion. Now, as always, this is part of my Dragonflight series, so if you guys haven't seen the first few videos, I highly recommend checking it out, and I will leave it in the description down below. But everybody, I appreciate you stopping by, and hopefully this video will help you out. But here we go. So up first, before we get into the complicated stuff, let's just give a quick rapid-fire pros and cons list of Inscription and Dragonflight. We're going to start with the pros, and I think the biggest one going for this profession is that there is a ton of variety. Now, we'll kind of dive deeper whenever we start talking about recipes, but there are trinkets, there are weapons, there are cosmetic items, missives, weapon buff items, so many different types of items that scribes can make. So whether you plan on focusing with Inscription or not, there is plenty of stuff to do. Kind of going along with that, because there is so much variety, there is a ton of markets available. So, let's say you want to really dive deep with Inscription, of course you will unlock those high-end materials, those high-end trinkets, those high-end weapons, and you will likely be fulfilling a lot of crafting orders. Now maybe let's say you aren't very much into Inscription, it's just on an alt, there are so many different consumables that are very easy to craft that you can simply sell on the auction house. And the last biggest pro, especially at the start of an expansion, is that there is a ton of gold in this profession. Now we will talk about a con in just a little bit, but a huge popular moneymaker for Inscription is Dark Moon decks, which is a trinket that scribes can make, and any expansion that these are available at the start, generally they sell for a ton of gold and make a lot of profit. Now, moving into the cons, there are two main ones, and they will not be very surprising. The first one is that it is going to take a lot of downtime. What I mean is that Inscription is just known for long AFK crafting because you have to mill herbs, and then you have to craft ink, and it definitely does not get better in Dragonflight, and I hate to say that it might get worse. Once again, we're going to elaborate this in just a little bit, but to give you a heads up, let's say you want to make the best ink which is needed for the best mythic item, you have to buy herbs and mill them. Then, of course, turn that mill pigment into your basic ink, which those basic inks turns into kind of the mediocre ink, which then, yet again, turns into that best ink. And there's multiple steps between that as well. So, just putting it out there, there will be a lot of AFK crafting. Thankfully, like I said, it can be done AFK, but that is just a huge warning. There will be a lot of crafting. And that kind of leads us to the second con, which that it's going to likely be very expensive at the start. Like I said before, Dark Moon decks are known for making a ton of gold at the start of the expansion, and honestly that is normally because it takes a ton of gold to actually be active in. If you guys don't know how the Dark Moon deck system works, it's actually a little bit different this time, but generally it's based on RNG, and you have to buy or create a ton of cards in order to make a lot of trinkets. So it does require a lot of gold up front to get started. Now, I know both cons that I just said were pretty scary, but I do have to say I like Inscription, so don't let those two things scare you, and we're gonna move on to part 2. So up next, before we get into recipes, let's talk about requirements, specifically reputation and any sort of profession equipment that you need. Thankfully, Inscription is pretty simple, as I can say you need every single reputation. So it's easy to track as you need all, but also that is a lot of rep grinding. To those who may not know, there are 4 main factions in Dragonflight, so you will need to rep grind with the Tuskars, the Centaurs, the Valdrakken Accord, as well as the Dragonscale Expedition. Then there are 2 more side factions, which is the Artisans Consortium, as well as the Cobalt Assembly. Now, a huge thing to note, the reason behind all of this rep is because scribes do create contracts, which is those items that people can use to gain additional rep for a specific faction. So it does make sense that in order to actually obtain that recipe, they have to rep grind it themselves, so rep is not always necessary if you don't plan on crafting that item, but that's just a heads up. And then we have profession gear. Now, because Inscription's a primary profession, it can equip 2 accessories as well as 1 profession tool. Now, once again, Inscription is keeping it a little bit simple, and the tool that they use is actually an item they can create themselves. It's made by other scribes, and this is the Scribe's Quill. And then the 2 accessories that they use is the Fine Print Trifocals, as well as the Magnificent Margin Magnifier. Now, both of those are crafted with jewel crafting, so you will either have to have an alt with jewel crafting to craft them for yourself, or you can simply order them from crafting orders. So don't feel like you have to have a jewel crafter, it's just a heads up. And so let's move on to part 3, which is probably the most interesting topic for a lot of people, and this is recipes and what scribes are actually going to be crafting. Now, before we get into the complex recipes, let's just talk about the main reagents that scribes are using. Thankfully, it's pretty simple, and scribes have 5 inks that they're going to be using during this expansion. Now, these inks are broken down into 2 categories. We have the basic inks, which is your Serene ink, Flourishing, and Blazing ink. All 3 of these are just simply from the pigments that you mill, which comes from the different type of herbs, and this is just your equivalent to Umbral or Luminous if you were active in Shadowlands. Now, the other 2 inks that you have available are a little bit more advanced. So for example, the Burnished ink, which is kind of the middle step ink, the middle tier, requires the basic ink to craft it. So it's just kind of a better version, and it's used for higher level crafts. Then lastly, you kind of have your mythic level ink, which is of course used for that highest tier of items, and this requires burnished ink as well as basic ink. So you can kind of see that there's a hierarchy of this ink, and honestly, it's just built on ink itself. So Cosmic just is a long process because of so many intermediate steps. Now, besides those 5 inks, there are 2 more main reagents. There are the Chilled Runes, which are very simple to make. They just require an elemental reagent as well as Serene ink. And then the second other reagent is called the Runed Wraithbark, and this yet again just requires more ink as well as the Chilled Rune, which I just talked about. So like I said in the con list of this right here, you can already see this multi-step process that has to happen in order for you to get the best reagents. Of course, the pro of this is if you decide to do it, there may be lazy people who don't want to do all this crafting, so they will buy the materials themselves, potentially from you, but of course, there will be a lot of AFKing involved. And so now we are officially in game, and let's just kind of walk through everything you're going to do. Now, of course, you have your basic milling, which takes in the different Dragonflight herbs and grants you the ink. Like we just talked about, you have your 3 main inks right here, which is your basic inks, which just requires the pigment that you get from milling, the vial, which is just a vendor recipe, or it can be crafted at a higher quality from jewel crafters, as well as another simple vendor item. Then you kind of have that mid-tier like I just talked about, which requires the 3 basic inks, as well as just a simple vendor item. And then lastly, you have that highest tier quality, which as you can see requires a few other items, a basic ink, the burnished ink, as well as the Runed Wraithbark. So there we go. Then we just have the other reagents that I talked about, and let's get into the actual items. And so the first item that you're going to see is probably super familiar if you guys had Inscription and Shadowlands. And these are missives. Missives are basically optional reagents that you can attach to either armor or weapons that will guarantee a specific stat. So for example, if you are somebody who wants to make sure you guarantee crafting speed on your profession tool, like right here, as you can see I have multi-craft, I could have crafted this item and put a draconic missive of crafting speed in order to guarantee that stat. The same thing applies to all of these, it's just depending on the stat, depends on the missive you want to unlock. Moving on, we have the more complicated side of Inscription, which is Dark Moon decks. Now, a huge change in Dragonflight is that there are now 2 steps to Dragonflight decks. You have the normal version, which you just collect cards, an ace through 8, you combine those cards, and you get the basic version, which is right here. This item level is a 372, but this is the item that most people are used to if you've ever done Dark Moon decks in the past. They are BOE, can be sold on the auction house, and are freely available. Then in Dragonflight, they have taken it a step further by introducing a higher quality Dark Moon deck box. As you can see, it will require that base version, as well as a lot of other recipes, and you'll be crafting this. Next up, we have our weapons, which is pretty normal. Scribes normally make staffs, and that's exactly what's going on here. Then we have a new system of optional reagents that are attached to the new Dark Moon deck boxes. So for example, you can put a sigil right here, and these are the items. Basically, they just add an ability to help improve your trinket. Then you have your common Vantis rune, as well as these weapon enchants. So, for example, if you are somebody who wants to focus more on consumables, you could definitely crank out these runes, and they just help people improve their weapon. So right here, you have a high chance to heal your target for an additional 5,000 healing, which could be very good in high-end content. Then you have your profession equipment, which most professions can have, and so as a scribe, you are going to be making alchemy, cooking, as well as inscription items. Up next, to all the cosmetic fans, we have some cosmetics right here, which is just some fun illusions that you can kind of cast on people. And then also, speaking of cosmetics, we're gonna skip to the bottom, and we have these new types of glyphs. Now these glyphs, I like to call them glyphs. Technically, people may not want to consider them these, but they're cosmetic items for our new dragon riding mounts. So for example, if we wanted to customize our renewed Proto Drake to have steel and yellow armor, somebody would order this item as its BOP, and then us scribes would go and make it. You have 5 different kind of cosmetic perks for the 4 different main dragon riding mounts. So if you are somebody who kind of wants to focus on the cosmetic realm, of course, these are going to be very popular for you. Moving back up, we kind of have some unique items. We have the bundle of cards, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but these are kind of how you generate and craft Dark Moon cards, which are used for those Dark Moon decks. Then you have the fortune card system. If you guys ever were familiar with the cards of Omen from the Garrison, where you craft with some pigment, you flip them over, and depending on how lucky you get, that card may be worth 1 gold, maybe worth 10 gold, or even 10,000 gold. That is what this system is. So if you guys were a huge fan of the cards of Omen of the Garrison, they are back, and, we can all become gamblers once again. Lastly, you do have the ability to kind of take items from cards. So let's say you have a ton of extra cards left over, you just don't want to deal with them. There is an ability to kind of take items away from them, so you're not left with a ton of cards, which is awesome. Then you have your reputation contracts, which are just very simple. If somebody uses them, you will gain reputation every time you complete a world quest. And then lastly, we have the draconic treaties. Now, if you watched my previous videos about gaining knowledge points, you have probably heard this name before, and these are items that you can craft for others that will increase their knowledge point by 1. So let's just say I am an alchemist. I could go onto the crafting order system, order one of these, and I will gain an additional knowledge point, and I can do this once a week. So depending on how many crafters are on your server, this can be a great market to get into. Then lastly, we just have the cosmetic items that I have already gone over. So I know that was a lot. As you guys can see, there is a ton of variety. And so you can end up being the scribe who has access to everything pretty decently, or you could try to focus in on something and say, hey, I want to get really good at weapons, and who knows, maybe I'll unlock some cosmetics on the way. There's just a lot of options. Now, before we get into the recommended profession builds, because I know that's what people want, let's first talk about the leveling process. So, like I've talked about a little bit in previous videos, depending on the profession, you can only get so high in your base skill level. And so that skill level with Inscription is 65. Now, Dragon Isle's Inscription goes all the way up to 100, but at a certain point, which in this case is 65, you will no longer be able to level up with just trainer-learned recipes. In the past, you would generally be able to level up all the way, but they've made it a little bit harder this time around. But that is okay, because still you are most of the way there. You will be able to unlock your specialization trees. You'll actually be able to unlock 2 of them, because you'll be unlocked past 50 skill, and with Inscription, you will gain about 18 knowledge points following my specific path. Now that path will be on screen, and that is just my current recommended build. Now the disclaimer I'm saying in all of these videos is make sure you go into the description down below and pull up the spreadsheet, especially if you are somebody who's watching this in the future. The reason why I say that is because it is still beta, and in beta already, these leveling paths have already had to change about 3 times, and who knows, it will probably happen again. So if you guys want to stay up to date, make sure you bookmark the spreadsheet, and of course, just check back, but currently on screen is what the path is starting to look like. Thankfully, it is very simple, and really it just depends on the price of herbs, depending on how expensive it is. As you guys have probably seen by kind of the breakdown of reagents, everything comes down to ink, which comes down to milling herbs. So, you know, if herbs end up being really expensive, then of course leveling will end up being expensive, but normally it won't be that bad. But there we go. Now you guys know with leveling all the way up with trainer-learned recipes, you'll hit about 65, and you're going to gain about 18 knowledge points based on the first craft bonus system. And alright, here we go. Here is what everybody wants to know, and I have about 3.5 recommended builds for all of the scribes out there. Now we're going to start super simple, and this is going to be somebody who maybe wants to kind of do Inscription on the side. And this will be the milling or ink master. And no, we're not giving people tattoos. But this build is generally just focused on your milling ability and the ability to craft inks not only faster, but also better. So this one is super simple. What you will want to do is spec into Rune Mastery, which is currently the first tree. You'll be able to do this at level 25, so you technically don't even have to get to 65 if you didn't want to wait. And you will have to put 10 points into the Rune Mastery main spec. The reasoning is at 10 points you will be able to learn a sub-spec, and this is where you have your first decision. Personally, I recommend going into the Understanding Flora trait, which will focus on your milling ability. So immediately speccing in, as you can see, you will gain resourcefulness when milling herbs, and as you put in more points, you will gain multi-craft, more resourcefulness, more multi-craft, and lastly, you will gain the ability to mill 10% faster. So let's just back up real quick. If we put 10 points into this in order to unlock our sub-spec, then we put 20 to max out this, we have officially spent 30 knowledge points. Keep in mind, you get 18 by just leveling up your profession, so you will have to gain about 12 in some other fashion, but generally 30 is not bad at all, and this is just going to increase your production. So the reason why I say this is best for casuals is because, let's say, maybe instead of focusing on these like super high level, weapons and everything, maybe you're just going to be knocking out some of these weapon runes, or maybe you'll just be crafting Vantis runes. Because these are commodities that will likely sell super fast, you're going to have to make ink super fast, so improving that milling process will just save you a ton of time. Now, you can decide to either spec into this first, or you can spec into this after maxing out your flora, but this is going to be your second option, which is the flawless inks. Now, what this will do is actually improve the ink making process, so after milling, and it just will help you create more inks. So this will increase your inspiration, letting you craft higher level inks. You will also gain multi-craft, so you can craft more at a time, inspiration, multi-craft, and lastly, you will gain a huge buff in multi-craft. So hopefully, as you actually craft inks, you'll be gaining more than the average scribe. Now, to back up yet again, let's say we have invested 30 points into this system. In order to unlock our second sub-spec, we have to put in 10 more points. So right here, we would go up to 20. So we now have 20 points into here, as well as 20 right here, and then we can of course max this out to 20. So in order to kind of sum this all together, if you were to fully max out this build, you would have about 60 points in. You would have 20 points in right here, and then 20 in each of the side specs. So this will get you the ability to craft more inks at a cheaper price, as well as to mill a lot faster. Up next, this is going to be for the Dark Moon deck crafter. So if you're somebody who is going for those trinkets, this is going to be for you. The first tree you're going to want to spec into is archiving, which is the second, and this tree itself is basically dedicated to the whole deck making process. Now, this is where I want to pause real quick because there is currently a huge misconception going around with Dark Moon decks. As I have kind of hinted at whenever we were going over the recipe foundations, is that there is the ability to craft cards. Normally this is the case with everything, but what you do is, you craft a bunch of cards, it's RNG, and then eventually as you craft more and more cards, you'll officially be able to form a deck, and then you're good to go. And this system works right here. You can craft these bundle of cards, which is unlocked through by putting 10 points into this system, and then unlocking these Dark Moon mysteries right here. But the issue is that these bundle of cards is barely giving aces. As you guys know, you need the ace through 8 in order to craft a Dark Moon deck, and the issue right now is that these bundles are not creating aces, so people are assuming that these trinkets are going to cost, hundreds of thousands of gold. But the misconception here is how to gain Dark Moon cards. In a huge change in Dragonflight, they are kind of kicking it old school, and they're bringing back the world drop ability for cards. So not only are you going to be, of course, able to craft cards to make up for any you don't collect, cards also come from world content. An example is, let's say you go out and fish, you can actually fish up a bundle of cards, and you can open them up for a few cards themselves. Also, we still don't know exact sources, but bosses, rares, random world items, random world creatures, treasures, all of those have the chance of dropping cards. So when calculating the cost, of course, once again, it's all up in the air, it's speculation, but keep in mind that crafting cards are not the only way to get them. So yes, aces, they're very hard to come by when crafting these bundles, but aces come from other content, so they're really not as super rare as people think. But with that being said, let's talk about this tree. So as I mentioned before, there are two types of decks. There is the normal one, which just is made by crafting 8 cards together, and that requires no specialization at all. So technically, if you come across or you buy 8 of the cards off the auction house, you can craft it and be good to go. But if you want to craft the higher level Dark Moon deck boxes, this is where you have to start speccing into this tree. So what you will want to do is spec into archiving, and you will have to put 10 points in order to unlock the sub-spec. Then you will want to unlock Dark Moon Mysteries, which is going to grant you the ability to actually craft cards, and once you put 10 points into Mystery, you'll be able to unlock one type of deck. Now, because the theory crafters are still working, I can't dictate, I can't say what deck right now is going to be the best. Hopefully we know by launch, but you know, once you have 10 points in, if we just do it like this, we have an option to unlock one of these. For today's example, let's say we pick Frost. So we can learn Frost, and there we go. We have officially learned the crafting recipe for the Dark Moon deck. Now, as you can see, this is kind of how this format works. I just mentioned, you know, you will be able to find cards, and if you put more points into this tree, you will gain more cards of Frost, or whatever, you know, type you put in. Then you will be able to kind of improve these deck boxes as you fill out this tree. Now, once again, decisions are decisions, and as a scribe, I will either have to decide, okay, do I put, you know, 10 more points into this tree in order to unlock a second deck? Let's say I also want to learn Fire. Or do I spend my points, you know, maxing out my Frost decks to be the best possible? So, you know, you can kind of min-max a single one, or you can kind of spread your knowledge and be kind of the basic crafter for all. Once again, I can't sit here and tell you what's best, but that's up to you. Now, like I mentioned before, these sigils are the optional reagents that you can attach to those deck boxes, but I don't recommend speccing into this until later. As you notice, in order to actually use these sigils, I have to put 10 points into here anyways, and then I would have to go through this tree and unlock the correct sigil. So this is definitely kind of an end game path, so I would focus more on the left side before focusing on the right. But that is kind of how this works. You're going to put your points in, and of course, you're going to gain some extra bonuses, but you will unlock here, which once again, you'll unlock other bonuses to eventually unlock your recipes, which then you can unlock, you know, better cards, being able to attach different optional reagents, and all of that. And this is where we get into the third main spec, and this is going to be for any sort of weapon or profession crafter out there. So what you will want to spec into is the rune binding, which is the third tree, and this is because they have the ability to unlock the high-level profession tools. Keep in mind, I mentioned at the start that the scribes are going to need that specific quill, and you get it from this tree. So if you wanted to be self-sufficient and learn this or sell this to others, you would have to spec in 10 points into rune binding. I accidentally put in 11, but it's okay. Then I would have to unlock rune carving, and then put 10 points into there, which then finally I can learn profession tools, which once again I would have to put 10 into there. So in order to unlock this profession tool, I would have to spec out 30 points. And the same thing applies to the staffs. So if you're somebody who is going for mythic weapons, instead of going, you know, the profession tool routes, what you will have to do is focus on wood carving yet again, and speccing into staffs. This will unlock the kinetic pillar, and depending on which one you're going for, you may have to put a few more points in. But this is kind of the general route you may want to go. Now, I have to say once again, I can't theory craft and say that these staffs are going to be in high demand. Most likely they might possibly be, but this is just a heads up if you want to go this route. Once again, of course, the more points you put in, the better your crafting ability for these staffs. So of course, if you have more than, let's say, 25 points, keep speccing into it, but this is just kind of the default setup. Now, I did mention that there's kind of a half build here, and I don't really know why I call it a half. You can definitely call this a full build, and this is just kind of for the cosmetic seller. Now, I mentioned there are those different runes, right? You have the Vantis runes, if I can find them. There we go, you have your Vantis runes, as well as these weapon sort of enchant runes as well. So let's say you're just kind of a casual scribe, you don't plan on going on to all that crazy mythic stuff, and you just want to focus on consumables. Then the rune binding as well as archiving will be for you. If you focus on the archiving route and go down the middle tree, you will unlock the ability to improve your contract and missive crafting. So if you want to focus kind of on contracts and missives, then that would be the tree for you. Secondly, if you want to focus on those Dark Moon treaties, which technically aren't consumables, but they're kind of more on that laid back side, in order to unlock the treaties, you're going to want to spec into this tree yet again. So instead of kind of going this left side for Dark Moon decks, you will mark into archiving and kind of go straight down. Then your kind of third option is if you want to focus on those runes specifically, you will spec into rune binding, but go with the right side of the tree instead of the left. Once you put in 10 points right here, you will choose to go to the runic scripture, and at 10 points in, you can either focus on fauna runes, which are those weapon ones. This will just help you increase your resourcefulness, inspiration, craft these faster. So any sort of mass crafting, this will be for you. So you could spec into that, or you can choose the Vantis runes, which is the same thing. You'll gain faster crafting, resourcefulness, all of that. Codexes are trinkets, so kind of ignore that, but these two will be for you. A huge thing to note is that you can spec into multiple trees. As you can see, I have points into here, as well as points into archiving, as well as rune mastery. So let's say you want to improve your fauna, 30 points into here, and then start speccing out to learn draconic treaties. You can mix and match this all you want, but that is just some basic examples, and I hope that makes sense. But everybody, there we go. That is kind of the breakdown of Inscription. Now I know this is a super long video. Sadly, kind of all of my Dragonflight ones are ending up being mini movies, but I hope the detail is good. I hope this makes sense, and of course, leave any sort of questions you have in the comments down below. I will either redirect you to a video that explains the answer way better, or I will simply just let you know in the comments as well. But everybody, thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you plan on being a scribe in Dragonflight and what sort of path you're going to take. But everybody, I hope you enjoy and have a good day.